good. And yes, nobody's in the waiting room at this point.
And the camera is on you?
The camera is on me.
Okay.
Oh, we don't have a camera in this room. Okay, so we'll just,
We do in the back.
oh. So we'll need to, otherwise we won't be able, I don't know if we'll be able to catch the full audio without it. That's my concern for the recording.
Gotcha. We had to do it this way with our last climate action plan meeting, and it actually did pretty well for my laptop.
So did you put the microphone into your laptop?
No, there was just my laptop, microphone, and camera was all that we used. Interesting.
Oh, okay.
And it
All
was
right.
in the large conference room.
Okay, we will try to make, oh, this is the USB for the camera and the mic. So we can, Jeremy,
Okay.
the leaf
We are setting up.
Luddite as a Luddite, but you know.
We will see Kate when she logs in.
Yep.
Can you send it by a Discord?
No.
Or by email?
It's wait, what did you say?
How did you send me the link again?
By email.
Yeah.
I forwarded the meeting invite again to you is what I did. Okay, let me copy the link and send it to you. There you go.
Okay. We start? That's when we'll be joining us eventually, but when we get started, because we only have to.
I'm not.
Oh, God. I'm just laughing because Kate's, Kate, of course, it wants everything firstborn, it wants her.
Email.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, yeah, leave this door open.
I
The
just-
Brown Act meeting. So it has to be in person. What did you there? But you made it. It's okay because we had tech difficulties. You're not late. Good.
The authenticator is downstairs.
Oh no.
What if you used a verification code? Oh, that could give your phone?
Yeah, well, okay, this even.
I did something weird today. I was trying to read Teams and it asked me for a password. I'm like, it never asked me for passwords.
You have to sign in part of the cyber stuff. You have to.
I mean, I get the authenticator thing and stuff, but it was like accessing Teams, not the email. So
Mine always does that. I think it's in cybersecurity. Often I do. It's like now you get on Teams, you need to get on 10 minutes early to do all the things.
yes.
Just calling Jim Myers to see if he can grab it.
Well,
Oh, sorry, Jim. That's fine. Kate's coming down. It's a long story, but anyway, Kate's coming down. Thank you. All right, bye.
Won't you? I know we're recording still.
Yes,
Are we
we are.
recording right now?
We're still recording, so
This is.
we can start the first part of the meeting.
Okay. We are encountering technical difficulties.
Okay, I will-
We're gonna start. There we go.
Welcome, everyone. Today is Tuesday, December 9th. This is a meeting of the Sea Level Rise Committee. Calling this meeting to order. We're calling it a little bit later because of technical difficulties. I know we can all relate to that. We don't have any minutes to approve. So first up is open time for public expression. This is on any item not on today's agenda for folks in the room. And there's no one in the room at this time. So now we will wait for Kate to come back because she'll be presenting the Sea Level Rise feasibility study outcomes, and she's working on getting her slides up and running.
Thank you.
And yeah, that's what's going to happen. We'll pause the recording, otherwise I'm all these gaps. I don't know how that works.
Okay, we're going to pause the recording until we're ready to get started.
That's it.
Okay, we are recording.
All right, fantastic. So again, we're figuring out the technical part, and Kate is ready to walk us through our Sea Level Rise update.
Yeah, so we have, there's a lot of activity that we have on Sea Level Rise, a lot of like projects, a lot of parallel initiatives. So, but for today, just gonna try and focus more narrowly on the feasibility study. And try this. So speaking just more specifically about what we've learned from the consultants in this context, and then we can have other meetings about other things later. So in the feasibility study, we've gotten the technical feasibility report from the consultants, which I have a copy of, hopefully you should have received, but it's very dense, you know, it's in engineering language. It is not an accessible thing at all. So we are going to try and work towards having a more public facing summary in January, hopefully. But I'll just go through what we learned, you know, kind of what options they looked at, and what we found out. So the tough part about San Rafael is they're already starting from this context of being lower than the bay. That in of itself, where we have, you know, the buildings, the businesses, the homes, the people, all lower than the boats, you know, that really constrains the opportunities that are available. So at most basic level, we can do something to block the water more effectively, you know, put something more substantial between the city and the bay, or be higher than the water over the long term. Do both, or do some in one place or some in the other. But, you know, the consultants summarized it with this graphic. You know, we have most of the city in this full condition. It's dry right now because we have the pumps, and we have only the highest tides does the water overtop. But overtop meaning that the bay comes in over the edge. But that is only a matter of time before that happens more frequently. So the consultants looked at 3 primary options, all focused on blocking the water. And then in addition to those long-term options, initial actions, which could feed into those longer-term options, but they're things that we need to do no matter what, essentially. And all of this was compared to a scenario of no action, to help put the costs and things in context. So each of those 3 alternatives was analyzed against different criteria. How effective would it be at preventing flooding? You know, how much space does it require? Is it permittable? What are the housing implications? You know, the economic implications. So for each of these, they're compared against all these criteria, which is why it's such a long report. And so we don't have time to step through each, but we can zoom in to any of them that you're curious about, and I'll just skip over some of the main ones. But just to introduce them a little more fully, the first option is essentially to put a barrier at the edge. So trying to put something that is more waterproof, watertight, between the city and the bay. You know, recognizing that right now the shoreline is just inches above our highest tides. You know, in some cases it's not higher than our highest tides. So, you know, intuitive response, make that higher, make that more robust. Some cases in the shoreline, what stands between the boats and my car is just a pile of stuff. You know, it's not a flood barrier. It's not intended to be a flood barrier. It's definitely not resilient to any kind of stress or storm. And we know other places, we see erosion, holes, other things. So this first alternative would be trying to create a connected barrier. You know, for any of those measures to be effective, it has to be complete, and it has to surround the whole area that's low lying. You know, where we have gaps in that barrier system, the water will just find those. And we do see that already, you know, in the canal. We have these low spots that the water is finding its way in. And right now, what keeps 101 580 dry is that the volume of water coming in is manageable, and that the city's pump stations are picking that up. If the water was a foot higher, 2 feet higher, the volume coming in would be overwhelming, and so making these roads impassable. But of course, like, just fixing it in one spot is not going to be sufficient. So really, for this kind of approach to work, it has to be complete and connected. And we have a barrier in some form along the waterfront, but then the hard part, of course, is the canal itself. You know, That's where we don't have the space or anything existing to build upon. And so much that is being, so many buildings that are half on land and half on the water. So any barrier needs some amount of space, and that's really the challenge. You know, not only Canal Alliance, but also, you know, people's homes and many, many people's homes, you know, very dense, a lot of people living in each apartment. And then the row of apartments from 400 down to 620, you know, there's a lot of those buildings and a lot of people living there. So the consultants, you know, kind of wrestling with this, the consultants said, and I will say a little bit hastily, said, well, what if we could just do a sheet pile wall on the outside of those buildings? So option one, around the 400 and around down to 620 and other places is, you know, what they said was put a sheet pile wall outside of those buildings as a way to get around the need to demolish. That I would say is not something that was well vetted. Is there space? Is that, you know, that is something that they were trying to do in order to get around the need to demolish structures. One other challenge is that
When you're talking about demolishing structures, you're talking about demolishing the building, the whole building.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, if
To raise it or.
Yeah. if like the barrier was to be on land here, it would be, you would need space to put it on land. And we don't have space available, so finding that space. So the other thing I'll mention with this approach and with others is that typically when you have something that's providing that public safety function, so like around New Orleans, around Foster City, people's lives depend on this infrastructure. Typically that infrastructure is in public domain for reasons of that is public safety. Right now we have private infrastructure protecting, you know, that's what keeps the new pump station dry. That's what keeps 580 dry. That's all of that infrastructure is lower than the high tide. But right now we don't have public responsibility for that infrastructure. So the second option is similar to the first, in that along the bayfront there would be a levee, but across the canal there would be a gate, and this would be something that could open and close. I'm just going to introduce it now and we can talk about it, the implications more, but they didn't study, except at the very beginning, the idea of putting something smaller up the canal. That is maybe something that could be looked at, but what they looked at was putting something at the mouth of the canal. The challenge is that the canal is also the bottom of a watershed, so a lot of fresh water needs to move out of the canal. So when we put up a barrier to water, it works as a barrier in two directions. So as you close the canal, the fresh water gets stuck behind it. So because of that risk of damming the canal, creating more flooding, different kind of flooding, it needs to have a large pump station so that when the gate is closed, fresh water can still be pumped out. The pumps required there are large. They're like akin in scale to this one that's pictured here. This is the same size. It's about an acre. And this is an aerial view, and you know, this is a large infrastructure, typically with diesel, typically with generators, typically noisy. Obviously, one could theoretically dress it up, but it's an acre, you know, it's very large. So just to put it in comparison, it's about 10 times the size in terms of capacity as this Francisco pump station. So this is around 300, and what we would need would be more like 3,000.
And I assume that the pump has to be wherever we need to pump the water. You cannot have like the building with the energy in one place and then the pump.
Yeah, maybe usually they're co-located. Yeah. But I mean, I think there are a lot of things, let me say, with this study where you think this is not the be all and end all options. There could be a better option, and that some things, no matter who the consultant is or how skilled they are, some things remain the same. This is a lot of water, a lot of energy, a big pump. You know, even if it was the most beautiful version of it, it's still substantial. So, and the other piece too, so Belmarin Keys has a lot for their lagoons, but not quite the same because they don't have to convey the fresh water for the whole watershed. But with all these like first two options and the third as well, when you have that barrier to water, it has to be there all the time. You know, there's always the risk of failure. Like this is a little breach from Belmar and Keys. And so you have to maintain that in perpetuity. And of course, like all infrastructure, you know, sometimes things do go a little bit wrong. And so that's just also something to keep in mind. There's just that inherent risk of failure. The third option let me just say that the consultants studied, which is maybe a little bit different than the way others have talked about this idea, is what they looked at for this third approach was a bayfront levee, that's the same, but along the southern bank of the canal to raise the edge through fill and retaining walls, kind of like Treasure Island.
So that looks like Treasure Island.
Yeah. So this is making an analogy. It's obviously a very like large and heavy-handed approach. One of the implications though is that the area that we're talking about now in the canal, it's subsiding. It probably is at like liquefaction potential, similar to Treasure Island. As they raised it, they also compacted the soils. They did like other groundwork to facilitate development on top. So that's what they mean when they looked at alternative 3. So it would mean that existing buildings would, let's say at a best case, be able to be raised and then put back down, but probably it would mean reconstruction. Reconstruction after fill and compaction and all. So obviously that has a lot of implications. So I'll just touch on now some of the criteria, the evaluation criteria. So the most important one is, you know, for me, one of the main takeaways is the time component. So they were quite explicit in that the risk of catastrophic flooding right now exceeds safety standards. It's not a safe situation. It's not a situation that, Joe, speaking personally, I wouldn't live in the first floor of an apartment there. It's not a safe situation, but we know that it's becoming less safe. And so the sea level rise is very predictable. The subsidence is very predictable. Those two things combined make it so that in 25 years, there's about a 1 in 5 chance of a catastrophic flood. So in their words, that makes it perhaps uninhabitable, you know, in a 25-year horizon. And you're always running this game of chance about hopefully there's no storm, hopefully there's no storm. But if there were a storm, you know, these risks are present now. So when we think about the effectiveness of any of these options, until there's that continuous system, it's not providing protection. It can be helpful to have one side of the triangle or two sides, you know, but really it has to be complete for it to really provide protection. So that's one of the challenges. So for each of the alternatives, they gave an estimate. How long would it likely take to design, to build, to get permissions? And then, you know, so for basically all of the alternatives is about the 2040s. And then they compared that with, you know, how severe is the flooding. And unfortunately for all the options, you know, to build projects like this scale in California, it does take 25 years, you know, so all of them are kind of running neck and neck with the flood risk. So that's really one of the challenges. I'll say that for each alternative, they gave an average and they had a best case scenario of, let's say in this case, alternative 1 did 8.5 years, starting in 2025. You know, that is very rosy. But thinking about, you know, if what's the fastest it could be done, and then for each one, a slow scenario. And so with alternative 1, which involves the bayfront levee and that sheet pile wall, from my perspective, the main disadvantage is that you could be in construction of that project and cross the threshold where it's no longer effective. So I don't know how to say that better than like, it may not last long enough to even finish construction. So that's one of the challenges. The other thing is that obviously it has a smaller footprint, but if there's a visual impact, but it may not just have that longevity. It's hard to redo that to build it higher and higher for the next generation. It kind of serves for a while until it doesn't work. That's sort of the challenges there. So for each of the alternatives, we have this kind of timeline, and they're all similar, with the exception of the third alternative being longer because it's more extensive. For the second alternative of the gate, this is, I think, one of the other challenges is that they said that essentially a gate is likely only permittable if it's only for emergencies. So if you can't really use it for sea level rise. If it has to close more and more and more, it's probably not permittable.
You mean by BCDC or by the Army Corps?
And there are a bunch of,
Okay.
BCDC, Army Corps.
By another outside
Fish and
agency, not.
There's a little list of 6 to 8, I think.
Yeah, and why would that be? Because of the use of the decreases there?
Yeah, so because as you close it, you have a big water quality impact. You lose the habitat, but also that pump has a big water quality impact as well. So, this is their recommendation. It's not a permitting process. They haven't gotten an official opinion. But their suggestion was that this not be considered because it's likely a non-starter as a way to sort of deal with sea level rise. It might be a piece, so you might build it and use it just in emergencies, but you'll still have to elevate the buildings. You'll still have to raise 400 Canal. You'll still have to build a wall or something else. So it can't, in their opinion, stand alone as a measure.
But didn't they also, I mean, we're talking about a changing landscape, so even though in today's, it might be hard to get a permit, 20 years from now, when all the other things are happening, the permitting might evolve where something that they're saying wouldn't be permitted would be in the future, because we're not going to have a lot of solutions here. We're going to have a lot of optionality. Did that come up at all?
Yeah.
In today's landscape, I get it, but we're not talking about today. We're talking about 20, 25 years from now. It might be a different.
Yeah, yes, I think absolutely that's right. And I think, so the gate was ruled out in the first Army Corps of 92 because also permitting, right? So
Right.
it's not in compliance with the Clean Water Act. And so I think that is true. But when we think about this timeline, or it could be true, yeah. For sure things are going to change. But when we think about this timeline, for it to be built in 2040, we have to start now. We have to start now with the design document.
Okay, that's fair.
Start
I know
with
that's
the,
fair.
And so, which is not to say that one couldn't do like a 5 or 10 year campaign to then like plant the seeds, but then you're pushing yourself that much
No, that's a
further.
good point. Yeah.
There's no right answer here. So, for a common to all of them is this issue of ownership of space. The canal is primarily owned by private property. Fortunately now, instead of 86 private property, it's 85. But that is still one of the larger challenges that's common to all of them. In the consultants' work, they estimated the number of properties requiring easements. I would say that is a desktop analysis. It would be a spectrum from easement to full acquisition. So this is maybe a best case scenario, but we're still talking about a large number of transactions, 60 to 130 transactions. It just has a time component, if nothing else. Some of the alternatives also would involve taking or disruption to all the docks and waterfront. That's there. And then in some cases, there would be a permanent displacement risk. One other challenge with the displacement, though, of course, is that without action, there's a high risk of loss of housing and displacement. In addition to that coming in the form of a sudden unpredictable event, we also will see probably deterioration that is more predictable as the stress of the salt, the stress of the flood, the dam, So that's something also just to keep in mind, and something that we've been keeping at the forefront. In terms of costs, for the no action scenario, they just looked at the damages avoided, which are large, but there's of course a larger cost too for lost businesses, lost, traffic disruption. The list goes on. There's a big impact, probably much larger than this, for inaction. Across all of the scenarios, one other thing I would say too is that there are certain costs that will be common. And so typically for federal cost share, it would be around a third of the cost. And then certain, with the Army Corps I'm more familiar, certain costs are always a local responsibility. Operations and maintenance in perpetuity is a local responsibility. Land acquisition is also a local responsibility. So the local sponsor creates the space for the public property, for the public infrastructure. And in this case, those costs are large. For alternative one, the estimated costs are around 700 million, with an annual O&M estimate of around 2 million. One thing to note though is that the cost to benefit ratio the costs are about the same as the benefits, which means that it might be much less competitive in comparison to other federal projects. Typically, if you have a better cost to benefit ratio, it's a more competitive, more likely to be funded. The cost for the gate does not include the cost to build the wall and to elevate everything. So this is, I would say, a very partial cost at around 500 million. There would be an annual maintenance and operations budget of around 8 million a year, with something like this. And then the third alternative is, of course, the most expensive, just under 2 billion, but they know that there's at least a potential for some recapture of value. But of course, this is not this isn't Stinson Beach, so this isn't something where we want to necessarily promote redevelopment and land capture value. So, that's also something to consider. So this isn't to be read, but basically we look at all three of these alternatives against all of these criteria. Each one has some element that I would say on paper makes it appear infeasible. Of course, we have to overcome the feasibility challenges. Inaction isn't an option, but these options all have, whether it's permittability, cost, space, 160 real estate transactions, each one has something that makes it, I would say, potentially infeasible. So I think that's important to make sure that's super clear. The feasibility study has not revealed that there are 3 equally feasible options. There are 3 likely very challenging options. Maybe with a path forward when laws change, when willingness to sell changes, other things would need to change to make one of these feasible. So recognizing that all of them are really challenging, they did pull out initial actions that are really recommended. So I printed out 2 copies because there is a little bit of nuance to them. They did them by zone, but basically they said things like maintain the pump stations, explore public acquisition, explore assuming responsibility for certain facilities like the Bayfront levee, constructing multifamily on higher ground. But in the actual report, each one has a little more nuance to it. But even though these are things that are recommended to keep people safe, they're recommended regardless of whether you choose door 1, 2, or 3. They are still a bit of a lift. They are still 10 to 20 years, several tens of millions of dollars. But to take the pump station as an example, it's essential to maintain those pumps. They're keeping the whole thing going. And of course, replacing them is probably of the scale of 50 million or so. But these initial actions are things that ideally can move forward now. So I'll just really quickly go through the next steps that we have kind of outlined at the moment. So we're still working on looking at the critical facilities with the consultants, and for example, for our fire stations or others, looking to see how low are they below the bay now, and what might be able to be done there. We're still working on preparing that public facing final report. And then in the work plan, we have to look at the best practices that are in the general plan, recommend some of those to be incorporated into the code. So for example, building code or other things. And then I'd just say too that we have a lot of projects that are just ongoing, being part of TAM, Sea Level Rise, group, or other things are just always happening, and trying to engage with the agencies that are building awareness of this issue with the agencies that have responsibility for the water, the sewer, the roads, the train stations, etc. I think there are some of the stakeholders that have a similar need to address this issue, and trying to make sure that they all kind of understand the context. With that in mind, we have the specific plan, which I think is an important space to try and integrate this, but Caltrans is also starting a sea level rise assessment for the highway, and they're in their own lane in a sense. So we'll try and bring that together as much as possible. Yeah, but we also have like the bridge feasibility 101-580 is a good example. That project is very vulnerable. They did a memo as part of CEQA. It's this vulnerable, it's that vulnerable, it's this vulnerable, it's that vulnerable, and then the memo goes in a drawer. So I think one of the chances that we have is that each of those projects, whether it's a new fire station, a new pump station, a new road, it presents an opportunity perhaps to nudge things in a slightly safer direction. Not always, but that's one of the things I think would be an important next step, is to try and weave this information into projects so that we don't build something new lower than the bay with the hope that someone else builds something else sometime.
Right. How is the new building for Marine Transit? Because that's next to Station 54.
The bus yard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're talking about using it for emergency response.
Parking lot.
If it's under the water,
Yeah. And a lot of it's electric, right?
It's
Electric equipment.
but they're going to have diesel as well.
Yeah.
For backup.
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. I'm not aware that they're planning to raise that facility, but
Well, they haven't designed it yet, and
Yeah.
so the city has lots of opportunities to weigh in about what's important there.
But yeah, although they do have a concept for the building and
So
So-
it sounds to be permanent. Anyway.
yeah. So I think we're there. So hopefully there's still some time for questions and discussion, because as you can see, what should we do? How should we proceed? There's not an obvious X, Y, and Z. So I think we have lots of immediate things we can keep moving forward with. And there's obviously larger questions about how to proceed. But Corey, what else did I forget?
No, but I think just to recap, I think one of the big takeaways is that there's not much time. If we want to take this on, if we want to move down a path of one of these directions, we kind of have to get going, because it's going to take a long time to build, to get the public buy-in, raise the funds to build. So we're kind of crunched in this time space, time and funding. None of the options are great. There are these initial actions that we need to move forward on. There's the whole idea of, which is in the work plan as well, of understanding, does it need a new authority? Do we need to have a planning and fundraising entity that has much more capacity than we have, that we fund, that helps us move toward decision making and toward whatever we're going to need for ongoing funding to maintain anything that gets built? Is going to have that ongoing maintenance. And then there's just the basics of the four things that the Community Steering Committee brought forward to council: emergency preparedness, evacuation planning, temporary housing for when buildings do flood, that type of thing. So,
Build and rebuild safer.
right, build and rebuild safer. Ideally, I asked Kate, what would be your dream, like, that coming out of this, at least like them. And she said, well, that all projects that are moving forward now start to actually build with flood potential in mind, that we're not building to what was in the past, that we're building to what we have now in terms of vulnerability and into the future. So,
I have a couple of questions when back to the Mike has any. So I'm sitting here thinking about the role of the private sector that currently owns those buildings, because you're talking about if there's a major flooding event. I mean, that's here and now. The city infrastructure, or the public, let's just say public infrastructure is what it is, right? You've showed the timelines. So I'm curious in the discussions, what is the role of the images that you showed of those multifamily? Because historically, it's not the public, it's not the city that takes on that responsibility. So I'm curious about that, if that.
I think that's a huge question, and I think so. I would say that one of the things that in my experience is unique to San Rafael, I'm not aware of other communities that are lower than the bay without public authority. You know, the levee might not be in good shape, it might not be well maintained, but at least someone publicly has a responsibility for that. So that's one of the shakiest parts of the situation in San Rafael right now, is that your people's life safety depends on what one property owner on the shoreline chooses or not to do or to do. So one path forward for San Rafael broadly, not necessarily for the city, but broadly, is to say we will go more down a road of the Netherlands, New Orleans, Foster City, the Central Valley, and we will assume this responsibility for safety through public infrastructure on the shoreline. You know, that's one path. Right now, though, no one has that authority or that responsibility. And I will say, not unique to San Rafael at all, but this question comes up all the time. The property owner who has the waterfront property, you know, well, how will I be made whole? How are you going to get me incentives? You know, this is something I heard a lot in Miami. Is the government going to pay me to raise my house? And in a certain sense, this is a private property with a private flood risk. And of course, communities can choose to get involved or they can choose not to be involved. And different communities make different choices about how much government involvement there is in that situation. But what's different about this situation is that that coastal property is very much affecting the highway, is very much affecting
That's interesting.
the hydrants, the fire station, etc.
Okay, so my next question is, I'm just thinking about that's just litigation all over the place. You talked about the 85 parcels. So you're going to be litigated against, and that was not part of the timeline that was there, the years of the litigation, the TROs that's going to be caused by the federal government or whoever, or the Marin County. So I was curious when they talked about that litigation of making the levy high or making it fall, or like not, we can't do any of this without that. So I'm curious, when you're looking at numbers and timing, where does that come in? But that's just the reality of it. I mean,
Yeah, and that's why they have like the fast and the slow. And I think the slow is even an optimistic, because of course, if you have the 5, 10, 15, well, but anyway, hurdles that you encounter, you know, that timeline could stretch into infinity, right? I mean, we have a system where individual property owners do have a lot of power to slow a high-speed rail project, to slow.
I can tell you, I can sit here and tell you stories about SMART and
Exactly.
or the path, like it is.
They have, that's the context, and yeah, so this
Okay.
slow does account for that a little.
Okay.
But it doesn't account for, you know, kind of the infinite amount of time that can go up.
And the very real costs that go along with litigation.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
so when you look at all those dollar signs, it wasn't even adding up. So that was my other thought. Again, unfortunately, and I don't know unless the state has sort of blanket immunity, or I don't even know what it would look like. But I have one more question, then I just have a comment really about the kind of the role of the state and the final, and Corey's building what you were saying about the funding and we need to get going now. But all this is being done in the context of the RSAP and the funding. So if you're talking about having additional technical resources or a funding mechanism, that has to come through the RSAP. I just don't, I have a hard time understanding a scenario where we would get in front of that. And I know that's not super fast. We still have 8 years to do it, blah, blah, blah. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but the numbers are so big, the amount of permitting is so big. Like, so I'm curious, when you're working on this, how does this interface with this state mandate around the RSAP?
When you say the funding would need to come through the RSAP, do you mean?
I mean that the dollars are so huge. For San Rafael to think that we're gonna go get $50 million to do this and we're gonna be able to outcompete all the other, I really believe the best way to do that, to address it around the Bay, is to have a centralized funding mechanism. I don't even know what that looks like. I don't know if it's through BCDC, but there has to be a funding model, because it can't just be every city for itself. I believe, I just think otherwise it's not sustainable. And
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really important because the third option, in my opinion, has the most realistic cost of 1.8 billion, because that involves an acquisition of them, which is a more realistic, in my opinion, cost than an easement in some of those cases. So I think that's the scale for San Rafael is like closer to 2, maybe hopefully closer to 1, but you're north of 1 billion. And so I think that shared funding is really important. At the moment, I guess I have been seeing the RSAP process as is quite prescriptive and quite procedural. So I wonder how, if that's I mean.
I think it's an
Yeah.
entry point to being something bigger. When you say 1 billion, 35% of the cost of 1 billion, like that's
Exactly.
actually, that's not even a realistic conversation to have. So let's like not even have that conversation. So to me, when you're talking about those numbers, it has to be at the state and federal level. And the only way we can compete at the state and federal level is to do the RSAP thing and to come as a region. So what the other takeaway I have of this, and I haven't read the report and I look forward to reading this, is maybe part of the next steps is utilizing this RSAP process, which you're right, it's only a process for actually some of these bigger things we're trying to get to. And we know it's been tricky working with BCDC, but to actually have it going towards that, because otherwise I don't know how we're gonna even knock off other
Yeah.
than keeping our pump stations, but even that we were able to because of the ARPA dollars. If it wasn't for COVID, we wouldn't have been able to upgrade our pump station. So let's just be realistic. So
Yeah.
maybe that's another thing, is that we lean into that. And I don't think I think we are ahead. You're ahead, Kate. I mean, your work here is unbelievable. It's so in depth, but maybe trying to drive regionally. I don't know.
I think that one of the advantages of having it all here, though, is also to look at the scale. Is it realistic for San Rafael to take on a $10 million annual O&M cost? Is it
Yeah,
realistic
right.
to try and build in the next 20 years a $2 billion project? You know, is that a path that we feel is a good, and there's no like correct answer, obviously. But I do think it might be, exactly like to your point, really helpful to have conversations with others to think, is this even a path we should really seriously consider trending down? Because will the state dollars be there? I can tell you that for the federal, I'm more familiar, and that is a competitive process. You're in competition with New York City, with Houston, with San Francisco, and the Army Corps process is even slower. That San Francisco project is approved, and their start year is maybe 2045, So the federal, because like with the dredge, each time you need appropriations, each time you need appropriations for the next step. And so that federal piece is slow unless you can get special appropriations or congressional, I'm sure there are faster paths, but the main door, so to speak, can be a slow one. And a competitive one. You have to be more competitive than it's
in New York. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, so that's the tricky part, I think.
Yeah.
But I think it's good though to assess how much realistically could be pulled together from state, federal, is it a good path? Because the other part that I think is tricky is thinking about the engagement, where we've been out in the community a lot. And so I think trying to also be honest about, will we sweep in with a $2 billion mega project, or is that being realistic with the community about, what the future holds?
So when you're engaging with the community, are you engaging the property owners? Because the communities are the community who doesn't, we want everything, no matter, you want everything, and you don't want to have to pay for any of it. But the property owners, have they been a part of any of this? Because I'd be curious one, what they have to say about it, and two, when this gets out, how are they gonna start to be able to get their refinancing on their buildings? How are they gonna be able to get insurance? Like, there's very real world implications, but I'm curious about the property owners, not the renters, but the owners.
I think that people, well, I haven't engaged with some of the owners. I would say I have engaged with people that also ask first, like, well, the city just needs to get its act together and build the gate. Or something to those, or for example, engage with homeowners that own a waterfront property and they're like, the water is almost in my living room. And I explain, you kind of have two options. You kind of block the water or elevate. We'd sell before that. I mean, so I do think that there's a curve of learning for everybody. And I think it's definitely perhaps an assumption that someone will do something for me to fix this.
So that's on the single family homes that are on the north side of the creek. So the property owners of the multifamily buildings, have they been engaged in this process?
With I don't want to say blanket, no, but I would say it's limited, right?
So maybe that's another way we need to have that conversation, because it's going to hit their financials faster than it'll hit ours. Let's just be blunt, because of, as I said, if they want to refinance, if they want to do flood insurance, any of that. So I think having the conversation with them, I don't know if they'll have access to additional funds, but they're critical for everything on the south side of the creek.
On the insurance, I think Canal Lines pays 55,000 a year for their insurance. We've heard from the Angel.
Conservation Corps pays 30,000 a year.
30,000. So the insurance piece is there. Now we've heard from other property owners that they can't get insurance. Some of the low income folks are buying some of the units in all cash because they can't have a mortgage because they can't get insurance.
Those are my questions. Councilmember Mike,
Yeah,
questions that you have.
Yeah, no, I have actually similar questions. The first one was around the owners and how we are engaging with them. The first question I got on Saturday, for King's Day is like, so the city is going to buy all the property, right? It's like, oh yeah, we have, so I think that's definitely, I was just thinking about insurance as well, and flooding, and in Cal Cities, for all the cities in California, I'm part of the environmental climate, committee. And there's a lot of conversations about wildfire, but because this only affects the coastal cities, I wonder how that's going to play with the state and also with the federal funding. And so, and then with the climate bond, are they going to facilitate some of the funding towards sea level rise? I know that when we were talking at the county level, it really makes sense for all the coastal cities to kind of like come together when we are looking out there, to look for funding, just to have, I guess, maybe more resources. And then I'm just thinking, when is the perfect storm, right? Like we live on the bottom of all these hills, and there's a lot of water coming from the hills. I don't feel we are really. It's not that the city's job, but like as like the water board, I don't think we are doing anything to really slow and sink the water. So in addition to the sea level rise that is coming, how can we work together with other agencies to maybe, I know that in the East Bay they did a lot of workshops for like homeowners to try to do that. I'm trying to do that in my house right now, like a rainwater. So will that make a difference if there is a storm, trying to prevent more water coming down at the same time that the water is coming from the sea?
Yeah. And I printed it because they did make a mention of that as one of the initial actions. So it's mentioned because
that's almost like the easiest,
Yeah. I mean, I think there's like a best case scenario. If that was 100% effective, it would be similar to there being no rain at all.
Right.
And you still have that flooding, but it wouldn't hopefully come as it does help, and it definitely does help, and it helps take strain off of the pumps as well. But we do still have like a pretty large watershed, so roofs are probably a smaller portion of the total, but it's not in this situation. I think we should do absolutely everything. Sort of all of the above. And I think the storm drain master plan and other things like that, maybe there could be more space for things like that.
Because when I see like the flooding, like in Red Heart, it's all from the rain, it's not from sea level rise. So we already have a problem around that.
Yeah.
So, you know, if we can work around that with some of the agencies.
Yeah.
I'm even thinking about the Marine Master Gardeners, you know, because that should be like a big initiative talking to homeowners and trying to do that. Also I'm thinking, you know, as we build the bridge to connect the canal, I know that in Europe, you know, especially in Northern Europe, they have or London and all these places, they have a lot of technology they are using now. Like if we're going to build a bridge, could it be done in a way that helps prevent at the same time, like help with sea level rise?
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking, like places.
Go back to that picture of that ginormous pump.
Oh, yeah, no,
I thought it was that one. I thought that's where
It's
the
a hard
bridge
one.
is.
So that was something that was, you know, consider, something that I also think could
Mhm.
happen as well. But then you have this challenge of creating a dam, which, and then fitting that sort of size pump in there is hard, but maybe it could be done in, you know, we definitely shouldn't take things off the table, you know, I think that's but with the bridge study, one thing maybe also is to look at testing the waters of maybe limiting navigability occasionally.
Yeah.
You know, that would make a fixed bridge possible. That would make the cost of the bridge cheaper. Could it be dual purpose eventually? Maybe, and when the rules change, you know, I feel like the bridge could help maybe explore what doors could maybe be there potentially.
Yeah. And I'm also thinking about like dredging. There are conversations now about like, because the last one was like, it took what, like 15 years or 10 years or something. And that's something that people had no choice, I guess, in the middle of the canal. But then if they wanted to dredge their property, then they would pay extra. So I'm thinking that could be something similar when we are talking about building like walls, or, I mean, it has to be a place where people have no choice but do something. And how are we the agency that is going to enforce that versus somebody else?
Yeah, and with that one, I think you can have, so thinking about the wall along the shoreline, there are good examples of both ends of this being fully public, you know, public easement, public space, public infrastructure, public maintenance, or like Fort Lauderdale, where they just mandate your wall has to be a certain height. If water starts coming through your property to the street, you get fined. You know, so it's super controversial, but it's a very wealthy, wealthy community that has flooding. So you know,
But it can only make sense.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, what's the incentive for the property owner to do anything?
and so you can have the same physical solution with a different spectrum from like public to private, regulatory to like funded. So that I feel like that is always there, even regardless of you have the same physical solution with really different governance and funding.
It's really interesting because all that regulatory framework, like what you just said, again, that's not something that I would put on the city of San Rafael to solve. It's too big. I mean, it's too big of a question. And how do we work with, who are those other entities? How do we learn from all of them? And what you just said is fascinating. But if we're doing a regulatory framework to have San Rafael put that into place, like, again, trying to get it done at the state level. I mean, Lord knows legislators are good at passing all sorts of laws. So to me, that would be a way to do it. So again, I think as you guys are thinking about this, is there something at the state level, some sort of legislation that would help us do what we're trying to do? And then we can work to find a elected official to sponsor that type of legislation. I feel like we're always getting these laws put on us that we have to manifest that we haven't driven, but this could be one that we could drive. I don't know what the thing looks like. I don't know what it says, but I think that might be an interesting piece.
I have another question. So we have one of the developers is doing the big 17-floor building right there. And I know that there are like a lot of CEQA exceptions. So, which is kind of like, how can we talk about sea level rise without the CEQA exceptions? And what are we doing right now for the new developers? I mean, do we have anything in place? Do we have to start thinking about more regulation around developing like right there? So what's, you know,
So, and getting certain exceptions means that you waive some of those existing requirements, right?
Right.
So setbacks, wetlands, and the city of San Rafael in the general plan has a policy that buildings should be elevated to account for sea level rise, but that's not in code yet. But it's in the general plan. That in and of itself, I can say for Miami, those kind of requirements do not break the bank, you know? If you're building fresh, 2 feet of height is not what tips your like financing.
Right.
But I will say that we have a lot of examples, Miami again, like a lot of examples where if you don't build for the water, right from day one, water starts coming in the underground parking or the playground in Loch Lomond, you know, being built on day one and floods. So I think hopefully it's in their interest to design appropriately for the site.
Well, it can be communicated to the public, so it's
Well,
everybody's interest.
I'm also curious too, in order to secure financing, right? They're aware of where it is, how much of that private market pressure, right? Because I mean, I don't know how much of that private market pressure is going to be like, well, we don't put the building to float in 2 years.
Yeah.
Like you
Or
need to
sink.
accommodate or sink, that you need to accommodate for that up front. So I'm just getting back to your earlier conversation about like what is the private market in terms of the insurance. On the wildfire side, we see that the insurers are demanding certain sort of upgrades to homes, and we don't know what the future will bring, but I'm wondering if the private markets will insist on certain things that we as regulatory agencies won't be able to push as quickly because, you know, the private market operates under a different set of circumstances than we do.
And I think that's what I'm seeing with the wildfire. It affects everybody in California, but the sea level rise not so much. Plus, it's happening, but it's not It's not happening like the fires are happening. So I don't see the emergency from people, and I think that's the challenge. How can we make it more like an emergency, and how can we like I just see it. I mean, 17 floors of land that is sinking. You know.
And I see in my day-to-day many projects that are not even accounting for current water levels, right? That bridge is how old, you know, it floods all the time. It's
And they knew it too, because
Yeah.
it was mentioned, I mean, I think that Caltrans knew about that, and they had, to your point about when they put in for the permitting process was so many years ago, so this is what was permitted. So they knew, I
Right.
mean, even when they were building it, they knew it. I think we had those conversations.
And we have many projects I could name names. But we do the secret document, it says in the floodplain, it says subsiding, it gets built just without those considerations. So and that I think is kind of one of the most expensive.
So on that, you said it's not in our local ordinances yet, but maybe that's something, and again, going what Councilman Marenka is saying, that we start to get those into our regulatory world, as it were. Because if you can name lots of projects, please don't name them. I don't want to know them. But we should get those in there. I mean,
Another question that I have, you know, is like Grange owns like a big piece of land, and a lot of it is marsh. Would it be helpful to, and I know that I think his son really wants to sell it, you know, trying to figure out what they're going to do. Do I?
I said, we're recording, so be careful. Yeah, so know that.
Well, no, my question is, would it make sense to preserve that as a way for the water to escape there? So I'm thinking more like about preservation as a tool.
Like a horizontal levee.
Yeah.
So, and we were lucky we got technical assistance grant from the Army Corps this summer, and they did a one-time assessment of the Bayfront levee, and so that report's available. That report found that having that open space is helpful for safety, even if something breaks or something erodes, so that big open area fills up first, it can absorb some of the impact. The other thing I'd say for the storm drain master plan, I know this hasn't been considered yet, but it's hard to store water in an urban area. Like you can do rain barrels and little swales, but those are small. When you have a large area, you can store more water, which can help, you know, so I think that's also maybe a consideration.
So I'm just watching the time because I'm so engrossed in what we're having a conversation, and I realize that we're over time. We did start late. So I know you're looking for feedback. Well, I'm looking for public comment. There's no one else in the room, so We always welcome public comment via email if you weren't able to make this meeting. So from the council, from the subcommittee, do you need specific feedback? To me, this is a report out in January. I think going to the broader council, however, in whatever format, either from a regular council meeting or study session, however you all think, because having the conversation beyond just Councilmember Micah and myself is so important, given everything that we just talked about. Everything top to bottom. Like this presentation, by the way, was amazing. Having the images, a million words for one image. It just is amazing. So is there anything else you need from us in this moment?
I think, if there's anything else that comes to mind that you want me to do, and like how to proceed. We named some of the next steps. I can share my suggestions. I think is helpful to take some amount of time to share this information and let it soak in for some of the other agencies, for some of the other property owners, for others, rather than kind of immediately jump into.
We can't jump. I mean,
We can't jump.
well, we can't jump
Yeah, we're not
because,
jumping.
because from our policies, so the council sets policies, so our goals and objective, we've already set them for year one. We're 6 months into the first year work plan. And then the next work plan is going to come for next year. So if this is not in the work plan, there's not, let me rephrase that. For it to be moved forward, it needs to be a part of the work plan, and something else might have to be deprogrammed or reoriented. So I think that's the conversation that the five of us would be around. Does this come into the year two work plan? Because I'm pretty sure it does tie back to our current goals and objectives. I'd have to pull them out, but I'm pretty sure there's something in there about it. So
Yeah, there is a climate change in
Yeah.
there. But just to present this report, beyond that, you're correct. We would need to program it for next fiscal year.
This is one of the goals and objectives, that kind of updating our codes based on what's in the general plan. So that is already captured.
okay.
Yeah, to me, it really makes sense to engage with property owners to present the information, the results from the plan, from the study, and let it sink. There's nothing really, I don't know that there will be any call to action, but kind of like present that to them so they're aware. I don't know what would be the best way to go around it. But with new developers, I think it would be really great to start looking at all the policies that we have around developing our sea-level rise and see if we need to look at the codes. And
So it's already in our goals and objectives. I don't think it's in work plan year one. So actually this work can be done, but again, this is all about capacity and resources. So that's why Angela's paying attention to all of that.
Taking notes.
As to whether, so my sense is it will probably have to be more robust in year two of the work plan. If it's, I was pretty sure.
This is in for the coming,
26, 27.
Yeah.
So it's in year one of the work plan, because remember the goals and objectives were 3
Yep.
years.
It was not that there wasn't promised that they'd all be enacted in year one, but that this is in year one work plan.
it's that, right? That isn't that what is in the plan?
No, in terms of starting to work on, so the general plan
Okay.
policies and making turn
Okay,
them into
the policies.
policies. So the start, Kate fill in that just to basically survey them, understand which of the ones that are kind of more priority. My sense would be that perhaps this group could review those again before we get to the point where we start to take them to council, and not all of them will be implemented in year one, but we can start to prioritize.
So on that, obviously we'll always have to review. Councilmember Mike and I love talking about this stuff, as tough as it is. Although when we're looking at this, we have to have community. These are community development issues. So again, that's the city manager's office to figure out what's the intersection of that. So we can do all the reviewing we want, but because we're not community development, I want to make sure that we're in sync. And
No, there definitely needs to be some alignment, and so we'll have some further discussion about, again, which priorities to bring forward and the timing of those. And yes,
And
definitely.
the thought was also we would bring forward, I think the list is something like 20 or 30 policies in the general plan related to sea level rise, and to triage between, where's the Venn diagram between what's important and what we think could move forward, and do sort of categorize them, let me say.
I think that would be helpful.
With the work that we are doing with Multicultural Center and Canada Alliance, are we still engaging with them? Are we engaging with them until now? to present the plan? I mean, what's the next step with them?
The grant funding that's joint ends December 31st.
Okay.
So they're like wrapping up through this grant funding, but then obviously the work hopefully will continue through with Canal Lines, through Western Canal Lines, through Tudor, through
Mhm.
MCM. They have a sea level rise working group. There'll be other connections as well. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just gonna move along because
Mhm.
I do wanna. And the meeting as will be here as soon as it is to talk about it, and get on to other things. So we have future agenda items. Subcommittee will discuss the need for future meetings in 2026. So as a subcommittee, we do adhere to the Brown Act, both having folks that the webinar is being recorded, the door is open, people can come into the room. So it's up to really to staff about whether it's done through the subcommittee format, whether it's done through a council study session. It's really up to it's up to the two of you. The two of us are available. So why don't you look at that and align it with the work plan and let us know.
Sounds good. We had talked about that we could set up maybe a quarterly, and then if we don't feel like we need to at a quarterly, we can always cancel and pivot to the next one, or we could set up biannually, and then if we feel like we need one, we could add one later. So I don't know if there's what do you think in terms of timing? I mean, the reality is just a lot of work between now and January 31st. So then to pivot into the general plan items and some of the work there, it's probably going to be closer to 6 months before we're
Maybe
here.
biannual, because also Councilmember Mike, you guys have CCAP too. However you want to do it, because I know sometimes these are really, really hard to schedule.
Yeah, it's true.
So I think we're here. Let's talk about it. Yeah. There are no members of the public to comment on future meeting items. So we look forward to meeting again at the time that you and Corey decide we should meet. And we, of course, be posted on the city website. And with that, we will adjourn today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've been very grateful to have you working on this on this last round.
And we're ending the meeting now.
May I keep these one? Yeah. You're a paper girl?